Okay, guys, good morning. Let's start, even though it's just 23 of us, so there are at least 7 people who are not there yet, but we go ahead anyway because we don't have much time. Now, I'm sorry for Tuesday, I couldn't be with you. In any case, William has been as kind as to put together a list to see when we can have a makeup session. And it seems that the vast majority of you would be okay with having the makeup session next week, either on Tuesday or Wednesday, if I'm not wrong. So I would say, just for, for the sake of doing things in an easy way, let's stick to Tuesday next week. And as for the timing, should we say Tuesday afternoon at the same time of the other lecture? Namely, we have the normal lecture at 4:30 on Tuesday. So let's stick to the same schedule. 4:30 on Tuesday, we have the makeup class. Then I'll send an email around to remind you all of this. Some of you cannot participate for their own reasons. So nothing to worry. We'll record the class as we do with all the other classes, and I will post it on YouTube. Okay, this being said, let's proceed into today's class. Now, last time we met, namely last week, we talked about, we went deeper into chapter 3. Now, what I want to do is to proceed to chapter 4 very quickly, because we need to go ahead, otherwise we remain stuck on the beginning of the treatise, and I don't want that to happen. And once I have covered quickly with you chapter 4, I will leave the floor open for you to ask questions regarding what has been said this far. So from the beginning of class to this moment. Then next week, we start looking together at chapter 5 and 6. And after the break, we will go on with the rest of the treatise. Now, one important thing about the midterm, I noticed that there is already a fixed date for the midterm, which is the 11th of November, is a Wednesday afternoon, in which all of you are free. So let's stick to that, okay? As for the oral exam, as you know, some of you have already gone through it in the past with me. It's a very simple procedure. We just meet online through Zoom, maybe, or yeah, we can do it through Zoom. And each of you will have a conversation with me lasting between 5 to 15 minutes. The topics are going to be the ones treated so far in the course. So I'm going to refer to the portion of text that we read so far and to what has been said in class, okay? All right, now let's go to chapter 4. So chapter 4 is the last portion of the text in which Plotinus focuses his attention on the power of growth. And in fact, he does something that, to my knowledge, he doesn't do in any other part of the Aeneid. That is to say, he introduces the power of growth itself as if it were a character. He has the power of growth to speak. From the point of view of the terminology of rhetoric, what Plotinus does is called prosopopeia. Now, prosopo. It's called like this. It means the making up of a character. So the power of growth is introduced as if it were a character with whom one could speak. And Plotinus imagined that there is a small dialogue between an imaginary interlocutor and the power of growth. Now, what is interesting in this chapter 4 is that the question that the interlocutor poses to the power of growth has to do, is formulated as a question regarding the why the power of growth makes. In other words, the question is centered around the final causality of what the power of growth makes. Quick reminder for everybody what the final causality is. The final causality is that form of causality which stands at the end of a process and is the underlying reason for something to be done. For example, if I go to the supermarket to buy milk, the final causality of my going to the supermarket is buying milk, right? Final causality, if you think of it, is one of the central ways to define making. Because we always make or do whatever we make and do having a goal in mind, correct? So, for example, I brush my teeth in order not to have them rotting, or I eat in order to feed myself. I cultivate the land in order, again, to feed myself. I entertain social relations in order to develop a full life, and so on and so forth. Long story short, and we come to that now. In other words, whatever the human being does or makes, he does and makes having in mind a goal. And the goal is, hence the final cause, what is called technically final cause or final causality, is an essential ingredient. Can you still hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Is an essential ingredient in the understanding of what making is. Now, what's the problem in this? The fact that there are a bunch of things that happen because they happen. So, for example, I cannot say that it rains in order to water the ground. It rains because it rains. I cannot say that I breathe in order to remain alive. I breathe because I breathe. In other words, there is out there a bunch of phenomena that can be looked at as being sustained by making, by a making of sort, to which making, however, finalism does not belong. What are these phenomena? Well, using a modern terminology, we could say that these phenomena are all those phenomena that belong to the biological world, or to the strictly physical world. As I said before, it rains because it rains. A tree blossoms because it blossoms. Or as Heidegger put it once, a rose doesn't have a why. Now, the human being, though, sorry, sorry, guys, my allergy is back, and I hope it doesn't start now, because if it starts now, I will to interrupt class. It can go on for half an hour. What was I saying? The human being, though, inherently understands making in relation to finalism. And in fact, Plotinus has this imaginary interlocutor address the power of growth starting from the question of why, that is to say, in virtue of which goal does the power of growth do what it does or make what it makes. The answer of the power of growth immediately cuts off this way of thinking, and it says, as you have it in the text that I translated, you should not have asked, but you as well should have understood through silence, exactly like I stay silent and I'm not in the habit of speaking. Understand what? That what comes into being is my vision, a being silent. In coming into being, it manifests itself as object of vision. And I myself, coming from an act of vision up there, I manifest myself as loving vision. So what does the power of growth say? The power of growth says that what characterizes her making is silence. Plotinus uses this word, silence. What is it meant by this word, silence? Well, silence is, of course, the opposite of logos, which appears a few lines before. A few lines before, Plotinus says that the power of growth doesn't make out of logos. Whereby logos, Plotinus specifies, is to be understood in this case, ratiocination or reasoning, discursive reasoning. The power of growth doesn't make out of discursive reasoning. The power of growth makes out of a certain silence. What does Plotinus mean by using this word silence? Well, let's try to think of it. If silence is the opposite of speech, and speech is basically the pronounced equivalent, the uttered equivalent of discursive thought, and if discursive thought is always led by an end goal which stands at the beginning of any discursive thought, then silence is the opposite of operating, having in mind a goal. So what the power of growth is saying is that it makes because it makes. And what is this making again? Well, we've seen that. This making is the act of vision, which possesses itself as act of vision. And by possessing itself as act of vision, has itself as object of vision. This is a very important point to keep in mind. A very important point. Because as I said before, it says that making is not necessarily defined by the notion of finalism. Okay? The notion of finalism enters into the definition of making once making is the result of an act of discursive thought. But the power of growth does not make according to discursive thought. Hence, the power of growth makes with no end goal in mind. Is this clear for everybody?
So if the act of vision makes without having an end of any sort in mind, then it simply makes based on what? Because in the commentary you mentioned that there is a higher logos that directs this direction of making.
Yeah. So your question is?
So what guides if there is no end in mind, then why can't the higher order logos be constituted as an end of sorts? Because it always unfolds in a certain way according to this more primary logos.
Yes. It's not an end in sight, first of all, because it's at the beginning first. And it's at the beginning already in an accomplished form. So what comes after this is the self-keeping to itself, the self-holding to itself of what comes at the beginning, out of which then all the rest comes. And this keeping itself together doesn't happen through discursive thought. It happens as the bare existing of what exists. Okay.
So the difference in the making a making based on discursive thought is that making based on discursive thought means that the object is not in an accomplished state already, and you're bringing it to that accomplished state. Whereas in the case of whereas in thesis is already accomplished, so there is no making of that mechanical sort.
Precisely. Any other question about this? Okay, so if there are no more questions about this, you can now understand what we said last week about the consciousness, the awareness that is proper to the power of growth. As we said, is not self-awareness, which Plotinus calls parakoluthesis, is not an act of following whatever one does, as if from a third person's perspective, but is awareness in the sense of having a feeling of oneself. The very same way in which I always have a feeling of my body. I always have an awareness of my body, an awareness that is pre-reflective. Okay, so we can now reattach ourselves to what we said last week. What is then self-consciousness for Plotinus? Self-consciousness, as we already said last week, is proper to the human being, and this not only for Plotinus, for everybody who thinks about it. It is clear that self-consciousness is something that belongs solely to the human being, on the one hand, but is also the mark of the human being living in a sort of detachment from a seamless immediateness with its own being. Let me clarify this point. But before I do that, let me start the air conditioning because it's getting very hot here. Sorry, guys. You do it? Okay, thank you. All right. Let me clarify this point. We said that the power of growth doesn't make out of discursive thought. Later on, Plotinus says in the same chapter, as we noticed last week, that the power of growth is characterized by an awareness, which means a feeling of itself. In this feeling of itself, the power of growth possesses itself. What does this possession mean and this feeling mean? They mean that the power of growth exists in a sort of immediateness to its being. And this immediateness to its own being increases together with the increasing of the level of reality. So once we go up to the nous, to the intellect, this immediateness is much more intense, much more direct than it is even in the case of the power of growth. In the case of the human being, instead, the human being, yes, of course, has that kind of awareness, that kind of immediateness that makes one feel one's own body, one's own being. But what mostly characterizes the human being is self-consciousness. And what is self-consciousness is what Plotinus calls parakoluthima or parakoluthesis. That is to say, the ability the human being has to follow in thought, in an act of discursive thought, its own acts, its own experiences, its own unfolding. If the human being as a phenomenon manifests itself mostly in the parakoluthesis, then the human being lives at a level, so to say, of detachment from its own being. The human being doesn't possess itself in the same immediateness that the power of growth presents, or that at an even higher level, the soul and then the intellect present. Okay? And with this, we have the two main topics touched on in chapter 4. The fact that making, when it comes to these higher realities, is a making that is not marked by a goal, is not marked by finalism. They make because they make. And this making is the result of their being, what they are. And the awareness that the power of growth has is an immediateness that binds the power of growth to its own being, its own way of being. By contrast, the human being lives at a level instead of self-awareness, characterized by discursive thought, and hence characterized by a detachment from the deep root of its own being. And that's pretty much chapter 4. Is it clear for everybody?
Yes.
All right, good. Now, let's see the first question. All these processes, Shibo asks, all these processes are the process of making or a series of execution with a goal that can be deemed as making? I don't quite understand the question. You have to explain it to me a bit. Which are the processes you're referring to?
Because you mentioned like a few processes as an example of making.
Mm.
So at the very beginning, you mentioned like you always make in mind. You always make with a goal in mind.
Yeah.
Then you mentioned like quite a few of them. So I was thinking like as long as like a series of action that with a collective goal in mind, then that can be deemed as a making, right?
Well, no, that's a way of defining making. I mean, the human being understands making mostly as directed by a goal, right? But there is no doubt that the tree producing a flower and then a fruit is a making, but it's a making that clearly has no objective in mind, right?
Yeah.
So the point there is to understand that making understood as based on finality is a human perspective. Okay, that's the point, right?
Okay, thank you.
Then William, if I could pose a question from the next bit of text in chapter 4, but while they stand, but while I stand as a no vision, I perpetually come into being. When our parents serve as the theoria from which we unfold as objects of vision, why are they said to be greater log? Oh, okay. No, he's not talking about our parents. There, the power of growth is talking about the soul and the intellect as if they were its parents, because they're the greater logi that come before it. Now, why does the power of growth say that the soul and the intellect are greater logi than itself? Well, because they keep to themselves much more than the power of growth is capable of. So whereas the power of growth sort of gets more and more towards the outside, to the point that it deals directly with matter, the soul and the intellect, even more so, remain as if contained in themselves without any outer interaction. Okay, that's what is saying there. Okay, so Johannes says, so I suppose Plotinus already stands in opposition to Aristotle, who explains physics as having telos. That's a very good question. That's a very good question. Does he stand in opposition to Aristotle or not? The point is what we understand as telos. In Aristotle, when you read book 2 of physics, right? Aristotle says that physis odosestin is physin. The power of growth is a path towards the power of growth. So the power of growth is its own end. So if we understand telos, as Aristotle seems to do, as accomplishment, then the power of growth is already always accomplished. And it keeps itself in this accomplishment by moving around itself, because that's what the power of growth does, right? If we understand instead telos as the projected final end, according to which I order all the successive unfolding of my actions, then we are dealing with another acceptation of the word telos. Plotinus is not contesting the Aristotelian understanding of physis as telos. Plotinus is contesting instead the second acceptation of telos. The acceptation whereby telos is not understood as an accomplishment which is already accomplished and whose dynamism consists in keeping itself in the accomplishment. Plotinus is contesting the acceptation of telos as the finalism determined and pursued through discursive thought. I don't know if I make this clear. Let me put it in other words. Telos, okay, that's the word. Telos can be translated as either accomplishment or final goal. Okay. Now, if we say that the power of growth is already always accomplished, we're saying that the power of growth is already there in a perfect state as such, right? It doesn't need to walk to an accomplishment. It's already always accomplished. If instead I translate telos as final goal, it means that I need to walk. I need to act in such a way as to reach this final goal. Correct? So the final goal is not there already. Now, how are we to understand telos? How did the Greeks understand telos? Aristotle understood telos as mostly the accomplishment. And when talking about the power of growth, Aristotle recognized that the power of growth is one such reality that is always already in the state of accomplishment. And it is in the state of accomplishment because it keeps itself in the state of accomplishment. That's why he says that physis odos is physin. The power of growth is the path towards the power of growth. That's the Greek understanding of telos, the most fundamental understanding of the word telos. Then Aristotle does recognize, of course, that there is a way of understanding telos, which is goal, final goal, and hence something that must be reached through a successive series of actions devised through reasoning and discursive thought. But that's already an understanding of telos, which in regard to thesis, also for Aristotle, is not only secondary, but it doesn't pertain to the making typical of thesis, already for Aristotle. So also in this case, we can ask then, if Plotinus doesn't have as a polemical object Aristotle in mind in this passage, in which he underlines the fact that the power of growth makes because it makes. It doesn't make because it has a goal in mind, but makes because it makes, and it's already in the state of accomplishment. Which one is the polemical object that Plotinus has in mind here, if it is not Aristotle? Well, again, we can remember what we said regarding the Stoics and the Christians above all, and formulate the, to my mind, quite sound hypothesis that Plotinus is again rejecting an understanding of the coming to be of things as being the result of the deliberate act of making by a maker God. Okay? So, long story short, to answer Johannes' question, long story short, Plotinus doesn't have as a polemical object Aristotle in mind. And what he says is not in contrast to what Aristotle says in book 2 of Physics. His polemical objects are rather the Christians and the Gnostics, maybe also the Stoics, I'm not sure about that. And the notion, the Christian and Gnostic notion that is fighting against is that of a creator God that as an agent, that is to say, as someone who operates out of the vision of a final goal, as an agent makes what he makes. Okay, that's the, I think, the contrast to be found to what Plotinus is saying here. Then Wemin says, can we say that the power of growth, and by extension the soul, is the causa efficiens of every making in this world? Yes, we can say that, as long as by causa efficiens, when we say causa efficiens, we eliminate, as I said, any notion of finalism, any notion hence of discursive thought, meaning I am the causa efficiens of cooking lunch today, okay? But when I say that I'm the causa efficiens, when it comes to me, what is involved in my making is, again, the seeing of an end that I want to reach, hence a finalism. When it comes instead to the rain is the causa efficiens of the ground getting wet. But that action, let's call it, that making of the rain on the ground is not led by will, is not led by, hence, I call it finalism. So yes, we can say that the soul, for example, and the intellect are the causa efficiens of whatever happens. That's correct. As long as we keep away from any notion of discursive thought and hence finalism. Then Yung Chung says, can I ask what is the telos of Healy? In the case of tree or of natural living things, the power of growth keeps them in their accomplished state. Please go on. However, in the case of matter, such as clouds, mountains, there is none of this movement characteristic of the power. No, okay. It's not that matter equates to mountains and to clouds and blah, 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 blah. Matter, what is matter? Matter is one of the principles of the being of things, which as such, though, is never encountered anywhere. What do I mean by this? Is mountain matter? No, mountain is not matter. Mountain is shaped matter. That is to say, mountain is matter that is already informed by the logos and the ethos. What is a squirrel? Also the squirrel is matter that is informed by logos and the ethos. What is the difference between the two, between mountain and squirrel? Aristotle would say the squirrel or the tree has life, is possessed by life. Mountain is not possessed by life. Plotinus would disagree with that, being a Platonist, and would underline the fact that, as also Aristotle would agree, mountain is part of the earth. The earth is not something bereft of life. The earth lives. Hence, also mountain, to a certain extent, is part of life. Okay? So, long story short, Healy is not the material in the sense of a stone or in the sense of a cloud. Healy is the material in the sense of what lays beneath all the changing. And the changing takes place as a passing from one form to another form. So the Healy is, if you will, a principle whose existence is reached through an act of abstraction, through an act of subtraction. Subtraction of what? Subtraction of the form by the mind. I look at a flower, okay? Then I see that this flower becomes a fruit. Then I see that this fruit rottens, and what is left is a bunch of seeds. Then I see that these seeds fall into the ground, and out of them, something springs out of the ground. And then this something that springs in the beginning is a very thin, shout, but later on becomes a thicker and thicker trunk, and so on and so forth, right? What is happening in all these things that I've observed is a movement going from one step to the other, and each step corresponds to a different appearance, to a different shape, to a different form, okay? Now, what is it that gets every time into a new shape? Matter. But do I see matter itself? No. How do I reach then the conclusion that there is something as matter? Precisely by proceeding subtractively through an act of my mind. Okay, so what is the telos of Healy? The telos of Healy is that of being informed by, that is to say, kept in a shape by the ethos and by the logos. Is there a moment in which Healy is not formed? No. Healy is always informed. There is no moment in which one runs into pure Healy, into pure matter. Okay? Does this make things clearer?
Because in this case, I was confusing it with the normal definition of like matter or the material world as the physical object. But from this definition, it's clear that it's actually what underlies beneath it, and you cannot observe it directly.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And by the way, what physics calls the material world, right? The material world is in reality the result of opposing, well, in the way in which physics talks about material, what is meant by material is sensible. It's what falls under the senses. And as such, it is opposed to what the senses cannot grasp. But at the point, I can oppose even my own body to, for example, a reality such as numbers. Numbers do not follow under the senses. Geometrical shapes do not follow under the senses. Nobody has ever seen the perfect circle. Nobody has ever seen the perfect square. The very same way in which nobody has ever seen the number 2 walking around. And there is a bunch of things that do exist, but we don't grasp them through our senses, right? So when physics says material, what physics really means is the sensible. That is to say, what can be caught by the senses. And in doing so, physics follows a translated, sort of enlarged use of the word matter, which is though quite misleading, because the word matter, the reality of matter, the word matter indicates a reality that is just as non-sensible as the numbers. Think of it. The very same way I never saw number 2 walking around, I never saw matter per se with my senses. How do I grasp number 2? Through my mind. Am I certain of the existence of number 2? Yes, of course I'm certain of the existence of number 2. Like I'm certain of the existence of all other numbers. Like I'm certain of the existence of the geometrical shapes. Like I'm certain of the existence of various other things, such as justice, such as virtue, such as you name it, right? And all these things are not sensible things. They do not follow under the senses. I cannot grasp them with my eyes, I cannot touch them with my hands, I cannot hear them with my ears, and yet I don't doubt of their existence. Matter is one such thing. Nobody has ever seen matter in its pure form, and nobody can ever see it. But the mind is sure of its existence. Why? Because the mind can, let's say, deduce the existence of matter by abstracting from all the forms that whose transformation we see happening also with our senses. Okay? Okay, all right, so let's go now to Johannes, who says, can also ask them if a tree, say an apple tree, is considered at 2 different points in time, one when it is just sprouting and another when it is bearing apples. There is definitely the same thing, yet the tree in the 2 different states is not the same. One is not fully grown, the other is. Since it is the same tree, it is in the state of accomplishment of the tree, but in the temporal realm, it is not yet fully grown. So can it be said to be not accomplished in some way? If so, what would be the proper term for it? Oh, I see. Well, first of all, what you call the same is twofold. On the one hand, the same is the tree, meaning that particular tree there is a tree. And what remains the same is the idea tree. So the same is the idea tree. The other thing that is the same is matter. Matter on which all these changes take place. So the same that you refer to is twofold. On the one hand, you have the same of the ethos. The same of the ethos which can be grasped as a something by the mind. On the other hand, you have the same of matter, and matter as such can only be named, but cannot be grasped by the mind. I mean, when the mind says matter, it grasps a privation. It grasps something that is not. What do I mean by this? If I say that matter is a tree, then I'm not grasping matter, I'm grasping a tree. But can I say that matter is the ethos tree? No. The ethos tree is the ethos tree. Can I say that matter is then the ethos sprout? No. The ethos sprout is the ethos sprout. What is then matter? Matter is the pure privation, the absolute privation of all forms. And it is on this privation that forms can alternate themselves. Okay? Then Lim Kok says, Kok Tong says, Prof, what's your thought of matter being a mirror? That's a similitude that Plotinus has come up with a few times in the Enneads. Matter as a mirror. It's a very interesting simile. Why does Plotinus use? I don't know whether Yu Kok Tong found it in Plotinus, but I find it an interesting simile because it tries to say that aspect of matter whereby matter is just the backdrop on which the easy can appear as easy and shape sensible reality into a form. So I would say that, yeah, as an image, as a simile, as a similitude, is interesting, to a certain extent is quite apt, but as Plotinus himself says, it's only an approximation of what matter is, if we can even use the verb to be in relation to matter. Okay, in any case, this thing of matter, guys, is one of the most difficult topics in Greek philosophy. Not only in Greek philosophy, in thought in general. If you think of it, it is truly a conundrum. And well, I don't want to pursue too far into this. So let's leave it at that. The topic of matter of Healy would deserve an entire course by itself. Okay, because what we would discover is that maybe through Healy, through matter, the Greeks missed the opportunity to think what Heidegger calls the open. And the open pertains to the human being. The open is the basis for the human phenomenon to appear. But that's another story. I don't want to go there, okay? Any other question?
Professor, I'm still confused because I think Johannes's question was about the distinction, because there is the state of the apple tree not being fully grown and the apple tree being fully grown. So there is two distinct states to the apple tree. So while the idea that it's the apple tree and it's the same apple tree is same in those ways, it is different in that one is grown and one is not fully grown. So what is the difference in terms of like their eidos, and how can we describe this difference?
The difference is contingent to that particular apple tree in relation to the eidos apple tree. Meaning that that particular apple tree has not reached yet the state of full accomplishment as apple tree. But the eidos apple tree is always in accomplishment. So the difference pertains only to the particular apple tree, not to the eidos.
Ah, I see. Okay.
Any more questions?
So Professor, I remember last time sharing with you about the flow. Would flow be the same as ichiosis, or have you not had time to read
I didn't have the time to read it. If I remember what you said, flow has to do with the flow of consciousness, right?
Yeah, they describe it as a state of mind in which characterized by a few different factors, of which a human is like absorbed in the activity itself.
Yeah, but given the fact that it has to do with some kind of human consciousness, is not yet the ichiosis understood as that immediateness of awareness that characterizes anything that is. Okay, I looked for the reference to that psychology theory, but I couldn't find it. In any case, the ichiosis has been likened by some scholars to a psychology theory that has come up at the end of the 19th century and that is still in use, by the way, whereby psychologists and neuroscientists notice that any reality, any, above all, alive thing is characterized by a level of awareness that does not imply self-awareness, where self-awareness is described by discursive thought, is characterized by discursive thought. So, for example,
I just found the description. It says that there is a characteristic which is a loss of reflective self-consciousness.
Yeah, which, by the way, is what we experience every day by the very fact that our entire body is a receptacle of tactile sensations. Think of it. I mean, where is the sense of touch? The sense of touch is all over our body. Anything that even touches me slightly, I'm going to perceive, right? Now, am I self-conscious, that is to say, do I reflect discursively on all these sensations that come through my tactile body? No, of course not. Yet, all the movements I do, my very walking, my very moving my hands, is based on my body being this tactile machine. I don't like to use the word machine, but see what I mean. My entire body being this tactile center of sensations. And in that, there is an awareness, a very deep awareness, without which, in fact, there could be no self-awareness. For example, they studied the case of a woman who, by having taken too many vitamins of a certain type, I don't remember now which ones, had lost the sense of touch. The result was that this woman, having lost the sense of touch, had lost also the ability to be self-aware and to do things. What does this tell us? It tells us that living things are characterized by this deep, pre-reflective or unreflected awareness, whereby they possess themselves, which is what Plotinus calls ichiosis. Okay. Now I have to find that the medical terminology, and I'll send it to you. It must be somewhere in my notes.
Yeah, so in the chat, I pasted the full description for the characteristics of flow.
Mhm. Yeah, intense and focused concentration on the present moment, merging of action and awareness, a loss of reflective consciousness, a sense of personal control. Yeah, but this is already, you see, a second state. This is already the state at which something that has started being carried out through discursive thought. So, for example, I want to make a soup. In order to make this soup, I have to cut a lot of vegetables, or even more clear than that. I want to make handmade pasta. In order to make handmade pasta, I have to do certain operations, namely knead the dough and then start shaping the various pieces of dough that I cut every time I need to make a new shape of pasta. The more I become good at it, the less I need to think about it. But this kind of immediate awareness that you're describing with the notion of the flow comes already after a process of reflection.
So in a sense, it has to be initiated in some way.
Exactly. Whereas the kind of awareness that I have of my existence, or the kind of awareness that my dog has of its existence, or in fact a tree has of its existence, is not initiated, is its very being. Okay, so that's ikiosis. All right.
Then brings about another question, because like right now there's a lot of talk and discussion about meditation nowadays. So meditation in most of its forms is a kind of initiated activity where one sets aside some time to focus on your breathing. So you can initiate the activity to be more aware of what the immediacy of things. So in a sense, wouldn't this ikiosis be initiated in some way and so not be?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. In the human being, yes, of course. And partially, Plotinus's project corresponds partially to the Buddhist enterprise, or the Hindu, for that matter, enterprise of surpassing discursive thought through an act of, we can call it meditation. By the way, there are scholars who think that much of Platonism, or at least much of Plotinus's speculation, goes into forming a practice of the Orthodox Church or the Greek Church, which is called hesychasm, which is I think it's spelled this way in English. Let me check a second, but it should be spelled this way. Yeah, hesychasm. Let's go check it out. I mean, you can go check it out. Hesychasm is basically a practice whereby concentrating on the breath, the rhythmical breath, one reaches immersion with that kind of deep awareness that is at the foundation of any being. And thanks to that, one reaches the contemplation, the vision of the, they say, uncreated light, which is the divine light. Okay, and why am I naming this? To say that what I want to say is that this is a sign of the fact that in Plotinus you do find a kind of project that is similar to the project of those who concentrate on meditation. A sign of this is the fact that much probably Plotinus's doctrines are present in the doctrines that are the foundation of this Greek Orthodox practice called Isychasm. Okay. So in a way, yes. Long story short, when it comes to the human being has to regain the kind of ikiosis which is foundational for any being, QoB.
So in this sense, we can say that the act of meditation in these particular traditions is just an initiated activity helping us gain this sense of ikiosis that animals already have.
Yeah, in a way, yes, you can say that. You can say that. And, you know, it's problematic as regards to how the position of the human being is seen, because it seems that Plotinus and also all these other traditions that are based on meditation seem to say that the human condition represents rather a problem to be corrected and overcome. But this is matter for further reflection later on as we go ahead.
But in this sense, the ikiosis that is described in the Hindu tradition, or at least in these traditions which make use of meditation, makes it pretty confusing as well, because it is said that when you reach this state of ikiosis or oneness, so on and so forth, then all your actions will become perfectly moral, like a sage or of some sort.
Oh yeah, because at the point, like also Plotinus says, at the point you are just going along with the unfolding of things. And the unfolding of things is reputed to be the unfolding of what must be. So at the point, it's not a matter anymore of morality in the sense of conformity to a code, but it's a matter of conformity not to a code, but to a state of affairs. Basically, the goal is that of losing completely, getting rid completely of the notion and the attachment to any pretension at exercising agency. That's what the goal is. Which is what appears also in the Gita. For example, if one reads the Gita carefully, not even too carefully, the point of the Gita is exactly that: eliminating agency.
But in the sense, there is still the notion of agency, in the sense that there are still actions taken by that series of witnesses.
Yeah, but there is no agent, meaning the agent is defined by a goal-driven will. That's what agency is, a goal-driven will. If I become instead one, that is to say, if I eliminate all discursive thought and my acting becomes the perfect immediate adherence to the unfolding of things, at the point there is no goal-driven will. There is only the spontaneous, so to say, unfolding of things.
So in this sense, this spontaneous unfolding of things is very similar to the power of growth, in that things are only just kept in existence.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right, so I would say that we can stop here for today, also because I have another class to go to in an hour and a bit. And we'll see each other next Tuesday. I'm gonna send an email to remind you all of our new appointment on Tuesday. And on Tuesday, as I said, we go through chapter 5 and 6. So read it up. In the meanwhile, I hope I can translate more chapters to give you. And yeah, we'll take things from there. All right. Okay, guys. Have a good day.
Thank you, Professor. See you.
See you. Bye.